At exactly 7:03 a.m., the emergency room doors burst open. No one expected what came next. A bloodied dog walked in, carrying the lifeless body of a little girl in his jaws. For 3 seconds, the entire hospital froze. What happened next would leave even the toughest doctors speechless. It was just after 7 a.m. on a bitterly cold Tuesday morning at St. Helena Hospital. Outside, the parking lot was glazed with ice, and snowbanks still clung to the edges of the walkways from last week's storm. Fog pressed against the glass windows like an anxious ghost, and the clouds overhead looked as if they were holding back something darker. Inside the emergency room, the world was a blur of motion. Nurses in scrubs darted between trauma bays, doctors huddled around charts, and pagers beeped like sirens in a war zone. The smell was familiar: antiseptic, adrenaline, and coffee that had long gone cold. Patients groaned from behind drawn curtains, phones rang off the hook, and gurney wheels squeaked along tile. It was the kind of morning that left no time to breathe. Then, without warning, the automatic doors at the front entrance whispered open. No one noticed at first. A nurse was adjusting an oxygen line. A doctor shouted over his shoulder for a blood panel. Someone dropped a tray in the distance. It was background noise, routine chaos. But then someone gasped, and the chaos cracked. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the monitors seemed to hesitate for a moment. Every gaze dropped, not to the entrance, but to the floor just beyond it. Standing there, framed in the soft light spilling in from the snow-covered sidewalk, was a large Belgian Malinois. His coat, once likely a rich tan, was now caked in mud, streaked with dark, drying blood. His ribs heaved with every breath, and his eyes, sharp, wide, and burning with something far more human than animal, scanned the room like he knew exactly where he was. But it wasn't the dog that stole the room's breath. It was what he carried. Dangling from his jaws, cradled with an impossible gentleness, was the limp body of a little girl. Her red sweater, shredded and soaked through, hung like a flag of surrender. Her legs swung slightly as he stepped forward, careful and deliberate. One shoe was missing. Her small fingers were curled into fists, stiff from the cold. Her brown hair was matted against her cheek, hiding part of her face, but what was visible was hauntingly pale, ashen, almost blue at the lips. The Malinois stopped in the center of the ER, paws slipping slightly on the slick floor. He stood still, waiting. His chest rose and fell, each breath shaky and wet. A single drop of blood dripped from the girl's sweater to the tile. No one moved. The room was suspended in a kind of silent horror, like the moment before thunder cracks. One nurse dropped her pen, the sound like a gunshot in the hush. And then the screaming began. A clipboard clattered to the floor, shattering the stillness like glass. It was the spark that snapped the ER back to life. In an instant, doctors and nurses moved, some stumbling forward, others hesitating only for a breath before instinct took over. The Malinois remained still for one more beat, as if waiting for permission. Then, with extraordinary care, he lowered himself to his elbows and gently slid the girl's body onto the tile. His snout hovered just above her chest, listening, watching, protecting. Her tiny frame looked even smaller against the sterile white floor. One nurse dropped to her knees beside her, hands trembling but practiced. Another doctor crouched opposite her, checking for signs of life. "Pulse is weak, but it's there," he said, voice low and tight. A young resident leaned in to lift the girl's sleeve and gasped audibly. "She's been tied up," she whispered, pointing to the raw, reddened grooves around both wrists. The marks were deep, angry, and recent. The girl's neck bore a faint bruise, and there were cuts above her temple, dried blood tangled in her hair. Her red sweater was stiff where blood had soaked and dried. The fabric clung to her like a second skin. This wasn't a lost child, this was a crime scene. A nurse tried to lift the girl's hand, but Apollo let out a low, protective growl, not aggressive, but a warning. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a second she froze. Then gently she nodded. "It's okay," she murmured. "We're going to help her." Apollo stepped back just enough to give them space, but never looked away. "Get a gurney, now!" someone shouted. Another nurse sprinted toward the hallway, nearly slipping on the tile. Within seconds, the team had her on the stretcher, already fitting an oxygen mask to her face, calling out vitals. "BP's dropping. She's freezing. Get warm IV fluid started. Notify trauma. This is critical." Through it all, Apollo hovered just beside the gurney, each step measured, every breath taut. Every time a hand touched her body, he watched, judging, listening, ready to intervene if something felt wrong. As they wheeled her toward the trauma room, a security guard stepped forward, arms half raised. "We can't have animals back there." But the lead nurse, eyes glassy, jaw firm, cut him off with a single word: "No." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. That dog had brought her in. He wasn't leaving now. The wheels of the gurney squealed against the tile as they pushed the girl down the corridor, her tiny frame limp beneath the warming blankets. Tubes and wires snaked from her body, the monitor's rhythmic beeps echoing louder with each step into the trauma bay. Right beside them, step for step, padded the dog. Apollo moved like a shadow, silent, alert, his eyes never leaving her face. When her hand slipped slightly from the edge of the stretcher, he leaned in and gently nudged it back with his nose. Then, almost instinctively, he gave her fingers a soft lick, as if reminding her he was still there. One of the younger nurses hesitated, unsure. Her training screamed that no animal should be this close to sterile equipment, but something about the dog, his presence, his focus, made her pause. She reached down, trying to guide him away from the gurney. Before she could touch him, a voice called out behind her. "Don't." It was steady, low, and commanding. The kind of voice that didn't raise itself to be heard because it never needed to. Dr. Harris stepped forward, pushing back his glasses. The lines on his face were carved from 2 decades in trauma. He'd seen bodies broken, families shattered, miracles lost in seconds. But nothing in his career had ever started quite like this. "That dog brought her here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Without him, we wouldn't even know she was out there." The nurse nodded, stepping back. Apollo remained close but careful, never obstructing, never panicking. When the heart monitor gave a sudden, irregular beep, he let out a soft whine, not loud, not frantic, but sharp enough that 2 doctors turned to look. "He's watching her rhythm," one of them muttered in disbelief. They pulled into Trauma Room 3. As the sliding doors whooshed open, Apollo stopped at the threshold. He didn't try to follow them in. Instead, he sat down, planted himself outside the glass, and stared through the window. Inside, doctors barked instructions. "BP's crashing! Where's that second line? We need ONEG now!" But outside, in the hallway lit by cold fluorescence, a battered, mud-soaked Malinois stood sentinel, his ears alert, his body still. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply watched. And in that silent act of waiting, of refusing to turn away, he told them more than words ever could. She wasn't alone. Not for 1 second. Not while he was there. Just beyond the trauma room's glass doors, Apollo remained perfectly still, his muddy coat clinging to his frame, his chest rising and falling in shallow, strained breaths. The hallway buzzed with movement, but no one dared get too close. Nurses passed with hushed steps. Orderlies slowed their carts. Something about him felt sacred, like an unspoken truth sitting in the middle of the hospital floor. Across the corridor, a gray-haired security guard stood watching, arms crossed, brow furrowed in concentration. He tilted his head, squinting like he was trying to remember a name from a dream. "Wait," he muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, more certain, "I know that dog." A nurse turned toward him, curious. The man pointed. "That's Apollo. He's not just any dog, he's retired K9. He used to work with search and rescue up north. I saw him on the news last spring, the Montana landslide. He found 3 people buried under 6 feet of debris, led the whole team through the wreckage like he had a map in his head." The nurse's eyes widened. A nearby EMT overheard and whispered the name to another. Within seconds, the knowledge began to ripple through the ER like a spark catching dry grass. Apollo. The name settled over the room with weight and wonder. No handler had walked him in. No command had been given. And yet, here he was, mud-caked and bleeding from his paws, having carried a child across who knew how many miles, through snow, over terrain that would leave a human lost or dead. A nurse placed a dish of water nearby. He didn't even glance at it. "He shouldn't even know where this hospital is," someone murmured. But he had found it. He had found her. And he had brought her to the one place that could keep her alive. One of the younger orderlies, barely out of training, whispered to the security guard, "You think someone sent him?" The older man shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the dog. "No, no one needed to. That dog made a decision." And somehow that made it all the more extraordinary. As the surgeons worked feverishly inside the trauma room, those gathered outside didn't speak much. But the silence wasn't empty. It was reverent. They weren't just watching a dog. They were witnessing loyalty in its purest, fiercest form. Inside Trauma Room 3, the atmosphere was electric with urgency. Dr. Harris leaned over the table, eyes locked on the monitor, while a nurse read off vitals beside him. The scans flickered under dimmed surgical lights, painting a grim picture in shades of gray and red. "Left lung is punctured," he said, his voice tight and clipped. "She's bleeding into the abdomen. BP's unstable. We need to open her up now." His team moved in synchrony. Gloves snapped. Instruments clinked into metal trays. Drapes were unfolded with the mechanical grace of routine, but nothing about this case felt routine. Not the way she had arrived. Not the way a battered Malinois was waiting outside like a statue carved from loyalty and desperation. Just beyond the trauma bay's glass window, Apollo lay stretched across the cold, sterile tile. His nose pressed against the door, fogging up a small patch of glass with every slow, exhausted breath. His front paws were extended, but his muscles stayed taut, ready to spring at the slightest sign of danger. Blood from a cut on his flank had begun to dry, flaking against his matted fur. A nurse came by, crouched gently beside him, and placed a bowl of clean water within reach. He didn't react. Another tried setting a dish of soft food a few feet away, whispering soothing words as she did. Apollo didn't flinch. He didn't blink. His gaze stayed locked on the tiny figure under the surgical lights. Inside, Riley's body looked impossibly small beneath the web of wires and tubes. The oxygen mask steamed with every shallow breath, her chest rising and falling like a leaf trembling on the edge of a storm. Her blood pressure dropped again. Dr. Harris barked orders, more units of blood, clamps, suction. "Come on, kid. Stay with us," he muttered under his breath. And outside, Apollo whimpered just once, just loud enough for the team to hear. A moment later, the monitors spiked. "She's fighting," a nurse said, stunned. "Her heart rate's climbing." The room didn't celebrate. Not yet. But hope cracked through the wall of silence like light under a closed door. In the hallway, a custodian paused mid-mop and watched the dog lying motionless by the glass. "That's not just a dog," he said quietly to no one in particular. "That's her guardian." And for every second that passed, every beep, every incision, every prayer whispered through gritted teeth, Apollo remained there, unmoving, unshaken, unwilling to let go. The hours bled into each other as if time itself had forgotten how to move forward. Shift changes came and went, but Apollo never stirred. He remained pressed against the glass, his body curled just enough to stay close, yet never blocking the view. His breathing had slowed, each inhale shaky, each exhale heavy, as if he was carrying her pain with him. The hallway lights dimmed for night cycle, but the intensity inside Trauma Room 3 never faded. Beeps echoed steadily. IV drips ticked like slow metronomes. The girl, Riley, clung to life inside a cocoon of monitors and masked professionals. But outside, on the other side of the cold barrier, her guardian never moved. A young nurse paused as she passed, tray in hand, and looked at him. "He doesn't speak," she whispered to the orderly beside her, "but if you look at him long enough, you'll hear everything he's begging us not to let happen." The orderly didn't respond, just nodded. Later, a janitor slowly approached, his uniform smudged with bleach and wear. He lowered himself to the floor with a grunt and sat cross-legged beside Apollo. For a moment, he just watched the dog breathe. Then, cautiously, he reached out and ran his rough fingers along Apollo's ear. "You didn't walk away from her," he said quietly. "I did that once, with my boy." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard. "But you stayed." Apollo didn't react, no bark, no growl, not even a glance. But he let the man keep his hand there, because he understood. And so they sat, side by side in silence, while life and death danced just beyond the glass. News of the girl's arrival, carried in by a bloodied dog, had spread fast. Police had already been searching for 3 days, combing miles of forest after 6-year-old Riley Lawrence vanished from her backyard. But until now, they'd had nothing. No footprints, no ransom, just silence. When the call finally came in, her parents were 10 miles away, speaking with officers at a remote checkpoint. The moment they heard St. Helena Hospital, they ran. They didn't wait for a cruiser. They didn't ask questions. They just drove like the world was ending. Inside the hospital, Apollo remained curled by the trauma room window. His eyes were half-lidded now, body shivering slightly from exhaustion, but he never looked away from her. Then the elevator doors opened, and her mother's scream echoed down the corridor. Mrs. Lawrence dropped her purse as she stumbled forward, her husband close behind. The moment she saw Apollo, mud-streaked, battered, and unwavering, something inside her broke. She fell to her knees beside him, arms wrapping desperately around his neck. "You found her," she cried into his fur. "When no one else could, you brought her home." Apollo didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes for a moment and let her hold him. Mr. Lawrence stood above them, hand over his mouth, tears streaking down his face. He didn't speak. He couldn't, because in that moment, words weren't enough. A mother's tears and a father's silence said it all. An hour passed like a century. Every tick of the wall clock was a weight. Riley's parents paced in tight circles, hands clenched, hearts suspended. Nurses whispered updates no one could hear, and Apollo remained in his place, still, alert and motionless but for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His ears twitched at every sound from behind the trauma room doors. Then they opened. Dr. Harris stepped out, his surgical mask pulled down, his scrubs streaked with blood and sweat. He looked like a man who had run a marathon through fire, but in his eyes there was light. "She's stable," he said quietly. "We stopped the bleeding. She's going to live." The mother broke first, her knees buckling again as she let out a sob somewhere between joy and disbelief. The father exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 3 days. Apollo stood. His legs wobbled beneath him, exhaustion surging through every muscle. But his body obeyed something deeper, something older than instinct. He stepped forward as a nurse gestured for the parents to follow. The door to recovery opened. He didn't wait for permission. Apollo walked inside like he belonged there, because he did. He crossed the room quietly and approached the hospital bed. Riley lay asleep, her skin pale but no longer ghostly, her chest rising steadily beneath a tangle of wires and blankets. Apollo reached the side of the bed and paused, then slowly lowered his head and laid it gently across her small hand. And though she didn't wake, her fingers twitched, just slightly, beneath his fur. The recovery room was quiet, peaceful in the way only a place that had come too close to tragedy could be. Machines hummed in soft rhythm. IV bags swayed gently from their hooks. Snow still drifted outside the windows, but inside the stillness held a warmth that hadn't been there before. For 3 days, Riley didn't speak. Doctors said it wasn't unusual. Trauma like hers could bury a child's voice in layers of fear and confusion. But even in silence, Riley was never truly alone. Apollo never left her, not once. He slept curled at the foot of her hospital bed, his chin resting near her feet, his body still except for the slow lift of his ribcage. Whenever she stirred, even slightly, his eyes would flutter open. A twitch of her leg, a shift in her breath, he noticed everything. And every time, without fail, her hand would reach across the sheets, fingers moving instinctively through the air, searching. And every time, Apollo moved closer, pressing his head against her palm, anchoring her to the world. Nurses tiptoed in and out of the room, careful not to disrupt the bond unfolding before them. Even the doctors spoke softer when they entered. The usual bustle of the ward seemed to pause at the threshold, as if acknowledging something sacred inside. Parents came and went, crying, praying, holding her tiny hand. But Apollo remained a constant. He was there when she opened her eyes. He was there when they filled with tears. He was there through every blood draw, every monitor check, every midnight hour. On the 3rd night, the head nurse paused at the door, watching the two of them in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Riley was asleep, one arm stretched out across Apollo's back. Later, in her shift notes, the nurse wrote, "We weren't just caring for a child. We were bearing witness to loyalty, the kind that doesn't ask, doesn't leave, and never stops watching over you." The morning Riley was discharged, the air inside St. Helena Hospital felt different. Lighter, warmer, as if the building itself had been holding its breath and was finally allowed to exhale. Word had spread quickly. Doctors stepped away from charts. Nurses paused between rounds. Even janitors found reasons to linger near the hallway. They weren't gathering for protocol. They were there for something far more human. At the end of the corridor, Riley appeared. frail but upright, walking slowly in a soft blue dress someone had donated the night before. Her hair had been brushed, and a tiny bow clung stubbornly above her brow. In her hands she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, petals trembling with each step. And beside her, always beside her, was Apollo. He walked a pace slower now, each movement careful and deliberate. His limp was noticeable but not mournful. He carried it like a scar earned, not a wound suffered. His coat had been washed, but some of the deeper stains had refused to lift, silent proof of where he had been. As they passed through the hallway, the staff stood lined on either side. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Some clapped gently. Others wiped tears before they could fall. Riley stopped once, halfway down the hall, and looked up at Apollo. Her tiny fingers brushed against his ear, and for the first time since arriving, she smiled. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. His mission was over, and everyone who stood there, hearts full and throats tight, understood one simple truth. She had returned from the edge, not just because of medicine, but because somewhere out there in the freezing dark, one soul had chosen not to give up on her. Not all heroes wear badges. Some walk on four legs, never ask for thanks, and love so fiercely it breaks the rules of what we think animals are capable of. Apollo didn't speak. He didn't need to. His loyalty was louder than sirens, his silence more powerful than speeches. He didn't follow commands. He followed something greater: heart, memory, and an unbreakable bond. He didn't carry Riley to the hospital because he was trained to. He did it because he chose to. And in that choice, he reminded us of something we often forget. That love, the kind that shows up, stays close, and never lets go, isn't measured in words or medals. It's measured in moments. Moments like a trembling girl reaching out in her sleep. Moments like a bloodied dog lying quietly by her side. Moments when the world says she won't make it, and one soul stands guard and says, "Watch me." In the end, this wasn't just a story about rescue. It was a story about what it means to be rescued: body, heart, and soul.